Have you ever stopped to think that many things we believed as kids still echo in our memories to this day? Those stories adults told with such conviction, which we swore were real, and only after a long time did we discover that they might just have been a mix of legend, fear, and imagination. But the curious thing is, even after growing up, some of these stories still make us hesitate. Go ahead and say you've never felt a twinge of caution when someone mentioned the boogeyman, or when they reminded you that swallowing gum was dangerous because it would stay stuck in your stomach for 7 years. Childhood is fertile ground for the greatest cultural myths. Every country, every region came up with creative ways to keep kids in line, or simply to answer tough questions with explanations that sounded magical. And we, little explorers of the world, absorbed it all as absolute truth. The result? We grew up carrying memories that, even after being debunked, don't lose their emotional impact. And here's where our journey begins. We're going to revisit some of these stories, understand where they came from, why they were told, and most importantly, how they still influence the way we see the world. Get ready to laugh, be surprised, and who knows, maybe even feel that chill down your spine again, as if you're hearing it all for the first time. Now tell me, what was the most absurd childhood story you believed? Imagine this. You're there as a kid, innocently chewing gum, when someone drops the bomb. Don't swallow that, it'll stay in your stomach for 7 years. The panic is immediate. 7 years. In a child's mind, that's practically an eternity. And suddenly the gum, which was just fun, turns into an almost deadly risk. But where does this idea come from? In reality, the human body can't digest gum because it's made of a polymer base, something like rubber. But that doesn't mean it'll stay stuck forever. The digestive system is smart. It simply pushes the gum along with the rest of the food, and in a short time, it goes away naturally. In other words, no 7 years. But the myth was perfect for keeping kids in line. After all, who would dare challenge that curse? The most curious thing is that this belief is so strong that even adults still hesitate before accidentally swallowing it. It's as if the childhood memory is more powerful than the scientific explanation. And that shows how certain stories aren't just made up. They shape the way we face the world. And if you think this curiosity is fun, wait until you discover how some children's stories were born from real social fears and ended up crossing entire generations. Now hold on to this one. Who hasn't heard of the famous boogeyman? That scary figure who, according to the tales, prowled the streets looking for disobedient kids. It was enough to not want to take a bath, throw a tantrum about bedtime, or invent mischief, and there came the threat. If you don't behave, the boogeyman will take you. The image was always the same. A mysterious guy carrying a huge sack on his back, ready to kidnap anyone who caused too much trouble. For a child, that was terrifying. Imagine playing in the street and suddenly seeing a scavenger passing by with a sack full of recyclables. Your heart would race on the spot. But where did this legend come from? The origin of the myth spans different cultures, and in many of them, the boogeyman was a tool for parents to enforce discipline. In Spain, for example, there's El Hombre del Saco. In Brazil, the figure became popular in the 19th century, associated with real criminals who, according to rumors, kidnapped children. Over time, it turned into a folkloric threat. The most amazing thing is that, even though it's clearly a made-up tale, there are still adults who get goosebumps just hearing the phrase. That shows how these narratives weren't just silly stories. They became part of the cultural identity and even the collective imagination. And believe it or not, the boogeyman isn't the only scary being that marked childhood. There's another character that a lot of people still fear to this day. And speaking of scary characters, we can't forget the famous bicho papão. Who hasn't heard that threat whispered before bed? If you don't stay quiet, the bicho papão will get you. It's as if, suddenly, the darkness of the room came alive. That open closet, the space under the bed, or even the sound of the wind outside, everything could be a sign of his presence. But who was this bicho papão anyway? Curiously, he never had a defined form. Sometimes he was a furry monster, other times a faceless shadow. That lack of detail was exactly what made it all the more terrifying, because the child filled the void with their own fears. And let's be honest, a child's imagination can create monsters scarier than any horror movie. The origin of the legend is ancient and spread across various cultures. In England, for example, There's the bogeyman, almost identical to our bicho-papão. In Portugal, they also talk about the papão. In other words, this fear crossed oceans, languages, and centuries. Deep down, it was a simple and effective way to keep the child in bed at night. The most curious thing is that, to this day, this myth lives on. Many adults still use the expression bicho-papão to refer to anything that scares or seems unbeatable. It's proof that some childhood stories never die. They just transform. But not all these stories were dark. Some, in fact, were too sweet to be true. If there's one story that enchanted entire generations, it was the one about the baby tooth under the pillow. Who didn't get excited about losing a tooth, putting it under the pillow, and waking up with a little coin or even a small gift in its place? For many kids, it was almost like magic happening in the bedroom. Silent, mysterious, and thrilling. But where did this tradition come from? The most well-known version is the tooth fairy, popular in the United States and spread through movies. But in Brazil and several other countries, the story was different. The protagonist wasn't a fairy, but a little mouse. Yes, the tooth mouse took the little tooth in exchange for a reward. In countries like Spain and Argentina, this character is called Ratoncito Pérez, a figure so beloved that it even became a character in children's books. The curious thing is that this practice has ancient roots. Some peoples believed that keeping or disposing of teeth in a special way brought luck or protection. Over time, the ritual gained more playful versions until it arrived at the one we know today. And even knowing that it was some random adult who left the coin, the memory remains magical. It's as if for a few moments, we believed the world had room for little fairies or generous mice. But not all childhood stories were that cute. Some were capable of leaving any kid in a panic, and even shaping fears that persist into adulthood. Who hasn't heard that scary phrase? If you swallow a seed, a tree will grow inside your belly. For a child, that was simply horrifying. Imagine accidentally swallowing a watermelon seed and days later, starting to think something was growing inside you. The fear was real. You could even feel tickles in your stomach just thinking about it. But where does this idea come from? Probably from adults' attempt to teach kids to be careful when eating fruit. After all, choking on a seed isn't pleasant at all. Turning that caution into a curse was an efficient way to etch the lesson into the child's mind. And it worked. Anyone who believed this story chewed with extra care. The most interesting thing is that, every now and then, science gave fuel to this myth. There are extremely rare cases where an accidentally inhaled seed sprouted in a human lung, causing medical problems. But pay attention, that's an extreme exception, nothing to do with the stomach, which is too acidic to allow any sprout. Even so, the mere existence of these reports made a lot of people think, what if? This mix of science, imagination, and childhood fear is what keeps these stories so alive. Deep down, they were like miniature horror tales passed down from generation to generation. And if swallowing seeds was already scary, wait until you remember the story that certain things could even transform your body forever. Who hasn't trembled upon hearing, if you make a funny face, your face will stay like that forever? It was like an instant curse. All it took was crossing your eyes or forcing a silly expression, and the warning would come right away. For a kid who loved playing in front of the mirror or making faces for friends, that possibility was terrifying. But what was the intention behind this story? Simple: to discourage exaggeration. Adults feared that the child, from straining their facial muscles so much, might get a cramp, or they simply didn't want to see that mess of grimaces all the time. Turning it into an eternal threat was the quickest way to set boundaries. And it worked. From a scientific standpoint, there's no chance your face will stick forever just from making a face. At most, a muscle might tire out, and you'll have a weird expression for a few seconds. But the power of this story lay in the suspense. The child never knew if that was the day the face would stick. The funny thing is that even as adults, many still remember that phrase when they see someone overdoing expressions. It's proof of how little educational white lies turn into cultural memories. And this wasn't the only story about permanent transformation. There was also the one involving food. Who hasn't heard, if you eat watermelon and drink milk, you'll die? This was one of those stories that stuck in your mind and turned a simple food combination into something almost forbidden. For a child, the idea that two common ingredients could be fatal was scary, and at the same time, fascinating. But where does this myth come from? There are several versions. One is that, in the past, mixing fruit with milk really could cause digestive discomfort, especially in times when food was less preserved and hygiene wasn't as strict. Result: a tummy ache here, some malaise there, and boom, the idea was born that the combo was dangerous. Another possibility is cultural. In many places, food beliefs were created to avoid excesses or simply because people didn't fully understand how the body reacted to certain combinations. Turning it into a deadly prohibition was the most effective way to convince any kid not to risk it. Of course, today we know there's no real danger in mixing watermelon and milk. At most, it might cause indigestion if you overdo it. But for a child's mind, this myth was like an invisible spell, a line no one dared cross. And the funniest part is that even knowing the truth, a lot of people still avoid this mix out of habit, as if challenging the myth would open a door to the unknown. And speaking of the unknown, some childhood stories went beyond food and reached the realm of dreams. Who hasn't heard someone say, "If you dream you're falling and don't wake up before hitting the ground, you'll die for real"? This phrase circulated among kids like a secret law of nature. Every time someone woke up with that sudden jolt in the middle of the night, it was almost a relief. Phew, I survived. But where did this idea come from? The real phenomenon behind it is called a hypnic jerk. It's that involuntary twitch we feel when we're about to fall asleep. The brain, transitioning to deep sleep, interprets the relaxation of the muscles as if we're falling, and triggers the reflex to wake us up. Simple as that. But for popular imagination, this sensation became fertile ground for scary stories. After all, how do you explain to a child that the body has these weird tricks? Much easier, and more impactful, to say the danger was real. If you didn't wake up before the fall, it would be the end. The curious thing is that even as adults, many still feel a certain fear when they have this kind of dream. It's as if the myth still haunts the subconscious. And, in a way, that shows how childhood leaves invisible marks that follow us even at bedtime. But among all these stories, perhaps the most memorable is the one that mixes imagination, fear, and beings that visit our room while we sleep. And if there's one story that left many kids on high alert at night, it's the one about the Sandman or even the Kuka, that creature who, according to adults, would come visit anyone who took too long to fall asleep. It was as if simply resisting sleep would open the door to mysterious visitors. And there was no shortage of imagination to complete the scene. Eyes peeking through the window, footsteps in the hallway, a whisper in the dark. The most interesting thing is that, in various cultures, there are similar versions of this figure. In Scandinavia, they talked about the Sandman who made people sleep. In Brazil, the Kuka gained strength through folklore, and even songs that rocked generations. The message was clear. Going to bed early wasn't just a matter of health, but also survival against nocturnal creatures. Today we know none of this is more than fantasy, but the feeling remains. Who hasn't stayed awake at night remembering one of these stories, with a racing heart and eyes fixed on the room's shadows? It's proof that childhood memories have the power to cross time and follow us, even when we already know the truth. And here's the end of our journey. Stories that were born to educate, scare, or simply entertain, but that continue to live inside us. After all, childhood may pass, but its legends never disappear. Now tell me, which of these stories do you still carry in your heart or in your stomach? Leave it in the comments, like the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing curiosities.